gone past 12, so I imagine most people are already here who wish to join. So, I mean, I guess we don't want to hold things up, so we may as well just get started. So today, just quickly, actually, we are actually honoured today to be joined by Geoffrey Boot, MHK, and Minister for Environment, Food and Agriculture in the Isle of Man government. And Minister Boot's going to say a few words for us now. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Brisha, and good afternoon. As we're just after 12 o'clock to everyone from a sunny Isle of Man. I apologise for my background. It's not that exciting. It's my office and the blinds are closed because of the sun, which is unusual. Anyway, it's a pleasure to attend this third webinar in our collaboration with our friends and neighbours, Dublin Bay and Kerry Biospheres, and to welcome you to the first webinar presented by the Isle of Man. One of the great joys of being part of the UNESCO Biosphere Network is that we collaborate with and learn from fellow biospheres. And hopefully some of you will visit the Isle of Man, as alluded to earlier, when this lockdown and terrible pandemic's over. We have a lot to offer, and I've been to Ireland on a number of occasions, and I know that Ireland has a lot to offer as well. Kerry, Dublin and the Isle of Man each have much that makes us unique, but also much in common in terms of shared culture, heritage and environment links. The webinars to date have been fascinating, and I hope you enjoy listening to our speakers today. Wishing you a successful event and year of webinars in this, the 50th anniversary year of Biospheres. And thank you very much, everyone. I've heard some familiar voices in the background from the Isle of Man, and I'm sure you're all keen to get on with your presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Minister. And just touching on having Kerry and Dublin Bay Biosphere Reserves with us, if I could just hand over to Eleanor from Kerry, followed by Dean from Dublin, and they can just give us a little bit of information about the biospheres that they manage.
Thanks, Brishi. Yeah, it's lovely to have this webinar series happening, and I'm learning so much about the two other biosphere reserves. So down in Kerry, we are actually a mountain biosphere reserve. We don't have a coastline, but of course Kerry does have a coastline. So I think a lot of people will be very interested in the content today about the Calf of Man. So far the webinars have been so successful. We're delighted with how the whole program is going. Yeah, so over to Dean, a little introduction.
Yeah, thanks very much, Eleanor. So the Dublin Biosphere is an interesting one in that it has a mosaic system. So we have a lot of nature reserves spread throughout the biosphere, and the buffer and transition zones wrapped around that in different areas. So it's a mosaic effect. And we've 330,000 people living within our biosphere. And we have the capital city at our heart, so it's quite unusual, not unique, but quite unusual. There's a number of projects that we're working on. We've an easing. We're linking with the local Irish Rail to promote interest in the biosphere in local stations, and we've actually got a partnership with Scouting Ireland, which came about as a result of some of the work that's been happening on the Isle of Man. So when the minister was talking about learning and sharing from each other, it's absolutely correct. You know, it's a great opportunity to learn and understand, and I'm looking forward to learning more from you guys today. So thanks, Brishi.
Thank you. Yeah, so just quickly, I'll just give you a few sentences about the Isle of Man Biosphere Reserve. I mean, the Isle of Man is special for many reasons, so much so that it's the first entire nation to be designated a Biosphere Reserve by UNESCO, which makes us feel really special here. So our environment, our community and our economy reflect our ability to be harmonious and sustainable. And sustainability is the kind of driving force behind Biosphere Isle of Man. Today, obviously, we're taking a closer look at one of our biosphere's most important places, which is the Calf of Man. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, who is Edmund Southworth, and he is the Director of Manx Natural Heritage. Thank you, Edmund.
Good morning, everybody, and a very great welcome to the Isle of Man. The screenshot behind me is, in fact, the view out of my front door on a normal sunny day. That's, in theory, brought up the title screen. And I'm sure Eleanor will tell me if I've made any technical errors.
Yes, Edmund.
Brilliant. The the Calf of Man is, as I've said, very special. And one of the reasons it's special is because it's really exemplifies those issues around human involvement with the natural environment. And a Man as the Biosphere is a unique UNESCO programme in that it's not just about the natural environment, it's not just about biodiversity, it's about the way humans interact with that. So in the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to say a few things about our biosphere, which may even come as a surprise to people on the Isle of Man, would you believe? But I usually have to start with a reminder for the audience that there are other biospheres are available, but we're the one that's in the middle of the Irish Sea, not on the south coast of England. But when you see us from satellite, you realise just how amazing our location is in the centre of the Irish Sea, surrounded by incredible places, but also at the heart of a maritime economy that goes back many thousands of years, and since indeed the time the Isle of Man became an island in the first place. So just to summarise who we are, we reckon that our occupation by human beings goes back about 10,000 years. A couple of thousand years before that, we know we had giant deer in the same way that Ireland had the giant deer, now extinct, of course. But we have a slightly different history in that we are an independent Norse kingdom till 1268. The King of Man was also the King of Dublin for a while, until he threw him out, but that's another story. And we're very proud of the Viking, Celtic, and indeed English cultural mix that makes us what we are today. And what we are today is a British Crown dependency, not part of Europe, not part of the UK, but very much part of the UNESCO Biosphere family. We're home to 84,000 people, but millions more, it would appear, describe themselves as having Manx ancestry around the world. I have the great privilege to be director of the Heritage Agency, which has been around for quite a long time now. Its origins are in the study of ancient monuments, but we've acquired a far broader remit, particularly since we merged with the National Trust in 1951. We work very closely with the Isle of Man government. It's always good to see Minister Boot. We attend a lot of meetings together. We're a statutory body, but we are charity as well, rather like the national museums in the UK. And rather like some of the other agencies that are around, we have very broad responsibilities, which include the statutory ones of museums, libraries, archives, as well as land management. And of course, we like to think we're an essential part of the tourism economy and very much at the heart of our local community. In terms of biodiversity, we are quite unusual in that not all of us are office-based. We have some 3,000 acres of land to manage, and we manage them reasonably well, I think, in that the diversity takes priority than the agriculture. But this is all done with the greatest possible emphasis on research and on the evidence. So we hold biological data and we have biological collections as reference for other people working. We're a founding partner of the Biosphere here on the Isle of Man, and I think as well as we're very much part of the educational side and active in terms of productivity. Here's the front end of our atlas, which is a wonderful resource. I say over 1 million records and counting. In case anyone does natural lives on the Isle of Man, the Orton sheep, one of the original Scandinavian breeds, and nothing would be complete without a Manx cat. So the Calf of Man then, it's quite a small island off another small island, and islands are very special. And even though it's now uninhabited all year round, there is a lot of evidence for significant use, and that is, I think, a key point in that it exemplifies some of those issues around the biosphere. What impact have human beings had on biology? Well, I'm going to show some examples, but to summarize, we've provided an incredible recording service as a bird observatory for 60 years. It's our anniversary year this year. Look out for the special stamps to celebrate. And the island's been protected by its National Trust ownership since the 1930s, and we've had the privilege of looking after it since the 1980s. I think it's been managed very much in the last 30, 40 years as a wildlife reserve, but actually that synergy with the biosphere gives us the opportunity to adjust the management, and this is something that Erica's going to talk about in a few moments, and really emphasize that synergy with the biosphere. Wonderful view on a sunny day. The short history, and it has to be very, very short, will show us that, like many parts of the Isle of Man, the followers of Patrick inhabited the island. They brought a language with them, they brought religious beliefs, and they brought art. And we know that the calf, as the rest of the island, has inhabitants from about 700 AD. But there are gaps in our knowledge. There must be Viking settlement, we just haven't found it yet. But we do know from the medieval period onwards, there's quite a lot of documentary evidence and references to birds, rabbits, and so on. It was farmed until the early 20th century, but it's always been important because of its position. It's been a threat to navigation. There are shipwrecks all around it, and it's no surprise that it gets some of the earlier Stevenson lighthouses, which date back to 1818. There's been a military presence since the Civil War, but since the relative peace of the 18th century, it became known to travellers and, in fact, a tourism destination from the 19th century. Some images, therefore. An amazing Christian altar frontal, which is pre-Viking. This could be Anglo-Saxon, it could be Celtic, but it's proof that there was a Christian settlement there many years ago. I found a few references which are worth looking at. Chaloner writing in 1656 about the island for the parliamentarians who were thinking of controlling it. Wonderful thing. This is either the puffin or the shearwater, probably the shearwater. The flesh of these birds is nothing pleasant fresh because of their rank and fish-like taste. But pickled, salted, they may be ranked with anchovies, caviar, or the like, but profitable they are in their feathers and oil, of which they make great use about their wool. The economic benefit of biodiversity right there in the 17th century. But there are other ways of using an island, and here's one. We have evidence, we think, for an Elizabethan hermit, but here's a man called Thomas Bushell, who was keeper of the king's mines in Wales, quite an important character, an ardent royalist, and of course the Civil War was fairly traumatic here on the island, as it was in other parts of Britain and Ireland. After the Civil War, after the royalists came back, Thomas Bushell decided to undertake a 3 years unsociable solitude in the desolated isle called the Calf of Man, where, in obedience to my dead lord's philosophical advice, I resolved to make a perfect experiment upon myself for the obtaining of a long and healthy life, most necessary for such a repentance as my former debauchness required, by a parsimonious diet of herbs, oil, mustard, and honey, with water sufficient, most likely, for our living forefathers before the flood. So the detox diet is not new. And then we have an unusual case from 1704. John Stevenson of Balladurl here points out that the calf had been in his ancestors' possession for a space of 100 years, till the Earl of Derby asked nicely if he could have it. What's interesting is that the compensation annually for the confiscation of the island was 500 puffins yearly. And the entire court case centres on the fact that 500 puffins a year was surely title of ownership. One of the great things about the calf is that we do have documentary references. Here's the Castle Rushen disbursements. John Farrant made barrels. He was a cooper. And in 1711, he got paid for making a new cask, put powder in, to be lodged in the calf. Powder is gunpowder, which means there was a military establishment of some kind on the calf. But by 1789, the calf was being visited by writers and diarists, and it is an amazing record. The rabbits on the island have formerly made £140 per annum. Puffins and the feathers of the seabirds about half that sum. But the profits on both these articles have diminished since the rats have got such a footing in this place. Well, over the years, the Calf of Man became known both for travellers and then tourists, and the pressures on it as a holiday destination became quite significant. And there is a wonderful story of Mr. Francis Dickens, who was on a train up to Liverpool in order to catch a ferry to the Isle of Man, and he overheard a discussion about a new development, a hotel, and probably a lido that was going to be developed on the Calf of Man. He hurriedly bought the calf and gave it to the nation, to the National Trust, and in front of me is a resolution of Tynwald in grateful appreciation to the generosity, and that preserving its natural amenities clearly was something that was very important to the National Trust. But it was also farmed, and in terms of Man and the Biosphere, the cultural heritage, wonderful traditions, and not sure whether you can make it out, but here are a group of shepherds removing the flock, as you have to do in order to control the numbers. Every flock of sheep every year has to be moved off the island. And of course, it's always a great holiday destination. And because it's even now the managers how we make sure that all the different conflicting pressures of managing an island are catered for, whether it's the tourists, the biodiversity, the sheep, the rabbits, the rodents, or the scientists. We have got to have a way of managing them all. And that's what my colleague Erica Spencer is going to talk about next. But thank you for listening.
Edmund, that was fascinating. Thanks so much for that.
There were one or two difficulties with my unstable. I'm passing on to Erica Spencer. Erica was having one or two difficulties with her presentation, and I have actually got it on my computer if, Erica, you need me to share the screen.
I think Erica's just joining us there.
She is.
Hello.
Yeah, Edmund, I couldn't see all of your slides, so I don't know whether it's an issue that we're having here or what. So maybe Eleanor, could you?
Yeah, I have it here. Let me just get it opened up.
And when we want to change slides, will I say now or?
Yeah, if you just say next. Yeah, next or next slide. Don't forget to prompt me. I've just hit the slideshow button there, so it should come up as full screen, hopefully, for everyone.
And can you see that, Erica?
I can see that. Brilliant. Can everybody else see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
All right, super. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to my talk. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the past land use and the current management of the Carp of Man. I work for Manx Natural Heritage. I'm the environmental planner and the ecologist, so a lot of my involvement in the Carp is to do with the natural history, etc., and the forward management of the island. I've recently been working on a management plan, so we're quite up to date with the way that we want to go. That's just going out for other stakeholders to have a look. Hopefully we'll get all that together and we'll get it out this year. So I'm going to start off with a little bit about the past land use. There will be a couple of things where there's a bit of overlap with what Edmund has just said, but not too much. Okay. So it's past land use and the current management of the Isle of Man. So we've got this picture here of some Vikings. We start with the first recorded ruler of Man, Godred Crovan, who began his rule in the Second Scandinavian period around 1079. The rulership of the Carp, and indeed the island, was handed down until 1414, when it was purchased by the 7th Earl of Derby, James, who was responsible for introducing rabbits. Next, please. Next, please, Eleanor.
Yeah, sorry, just going to
He was responsible for introducing rabbits to the Carp of Man as a source of food and game. Here's our rabbits. Over the years, Carp has been worked by various owners and tenants alike. A number of animals were trialled, including deer, goats, sheep, pigs and cattle, although only the sheep really seemed to be suited to what could be a rather hostile winter weather. Fields were created to contain livestock and surrounded by an extensive web of dry stone walls, which are still very much in evidence today. Eleanor? Here on this slide we can see a black and white aerial taken by the RAF during the Second World War in their reconnaissance, but very useful for us today for land management, especially when we're looking at invasion of certain species, like bracken. So we've got a bit of an idea about fields that were created for farming over centuries. So next slide, Eleanor, please. So arable crops enjoyed mixed success, but were largely dependent on lime being brought to the Carp to spread on the acid soil. In its heyday, the Carp boasted working corn mill, smithy, vibrant farm with a large farmhouse, outbuildings, and a population of around 30 people. Next slide, Eleanor. Unfortunately, the difficulties of getting stocks and goods to the Carp, its lack of amenities, including electricity, and the unpredictable weather conditions, meant that the islanders sometimes had to rely on the rabbits, which pre-mix and mitosis covered the island in huge quantities. So we've got two pictures here. One is the sheep being ferried over to the Carp. You can just about see sheep in the nets, I hope. And the other is the cattle, because the cattle fared a little worse. They had to swim over to the Carp, and the nearest point is from the Sound to what is now called Cow Harbour. And amazingly, no cattle were actually lost by swimming them over. They all seem to manage it. There's a picture of cattle entering the water ready for their big swim. Next, please, Eleanor. For many years, the significance of the carp's location within the Irish Sea has been recognised for its value to wildlife and a stop-off point for migrating birds. It's been the dream of many naturalists to see the carp become an accredited bird observatory, and by 1962 the carp was accepted. Today it is managed primarily, but not exclusively, for its bird life. Management of the island is aimed at conserving and enhancing the island's favourable features through a set of management objectives and includes factors such as legal management. The Isle of Man is a signatory to a number of international conventions. Next, please, Alana. Including the Bonn Convention for the Conservation of Migratory Species and the Berne Convention, which is a treaty aimed at protecting both species and habitats through international collaboration. Next, please, Eleanor. Many species, such as common lizards and choughs, are protected under our own Wildlife Act. The Isle of Man has its own Biodiversity Action Plan, which provides a baseline for minimising the loss of species and habitat. And the carp is also protected under Manx Natural Heritage bylaws, making it illegal to carry out certain actions, such as starting bonfires whilst on the island. Conservation of habitats on which wildlife depend is key to the management of the island. The range of habitats on the carp include coastal cliffs. We ask boat owners not to cruise within a certain distance of the cliffs during the breeding season. Semi-natural grassland and maritime heath, which we manage through grazing with our resident flock of oxen sheep. Next, please, Eleanor. Daily netting of birds including migrants, takes place as weather conditions allow. The warden records the birds' biometric details and ring them before release. It's the picture of a Heligoland trap. The birds fly in at the far end, just off the photograph, and they're able to be collected at the little area that you can see in front of you. It's very successful. It doesn't cause the birds any harm at all, and it's been used on the carp for, well, really since it was declared an accredited bird observatory. Next, please, Helena. Daily bird counts are carried out by controlled observation. Data gathering feeds into national databases, building up a countrywide picture of Britain's migratory and resident bird species. So here are some of the birds that are caught regularly. They're ringed, their feathers are measured, weighed, and then they're released. Next, please, Helena. And this is a picture of one of our volunteer wardens, Rob, who's out in the field. As you can see, he's showing the bird that he's just ringed and he'll have weighed it, etc. The little cardboard tubes on the table there are used for popping the bird into, and then they're weighed. The whole thing takes a matter of about a minute, and then the bird's released unharmed. Next, please, Oliver. One of the more iconic birds on the carp is the red-billed chough. Following a huge national decline, chough numbers have begun to stabilise, with populations at an estimated 400 plus breeding pairs across the British Isles. Colour ringing, as you can see on this photograph, allows for their movements to be tracked, providing valuable information about their genetic distribution. To manage for the birds, we need to keep reviewing our understanding of their ecological needs. Next, please, Eleanor. This is a picture of a young chough. You can see the tufts of new feathers on its head. Well, that was a picture, and you could see, sorry, you could see the rings on its legs as well. So what we've got now is, I've just said that to manage for this particular species, chough, we've gone back to the, so yeah, you can see on the legs of this young chough the colour rings. So in order to manage for the birds, we need to keep reviewing our understanding of their ecological needs, as I just said. And to achieve this, excuse me, the wardens monitor the populations through regular bird counts. They record the number of breeding birds, colouring in the young, as you've just seen in the last slide. They create and maintain appropriate habitat. Choughs are primarily invertebrate feeders who need access to burst soil, ideally within a mosaic of vegetation to forage for food. Young choughs seek out invertebrates and animal dung as it's an easy food source. During the winter months, arable land is important as they eat grain to supplement their diet. This slide is just got really sort of bringing up what I'm saying. Next slide, please, Eleanor. Invasive species are a problem in our modern world, and even a small island such as the calf cannot escape their intrusion. Bracken, as you can see here, likely to have been introduced during the time the calf was farmed, needs to be monitored and controlled to prevent habitat loss. This work, however, cannot be undertaken without a management strategy, as bracken can be advantageous in places. For example, next slide please, Eleanor. For example, the dark green fritillary butterfly is one of our strongest flyers, but it prefers to remain local in its distribution. To complete their life cycle, they require a range of features. They require areas of tall vegetation in which to rest and escape predation. They like patches of lush violets on which they can deposit their eggs. These violets should ideally be close to patches of bracken. Close proximity to purple thistle and knapweed they also prefer, in which to obtain nectar. So as you can see, where, how and when to control bracken needs to be carefully considered. Next slide please, Eleanor. In addition to the bird life, the calf supports a dynamic and diverse biodiversity, including the delicate thrift clearwing moth, as you can see here, obtaining nectar from thrift. Next slide please, Eleanor. The Isle of Man's only reptile, the common lizard, is also present on the calf. It is possible that, having been isolated from the mainland for many hundreds of years, the calf lizard population may be showing differences in their genetic diversity to that of the mainland population. This is an area that we would very much like to research further. Our only amphibian, the common frog, is also present, although non-marine mammals are poorly represented on the calf, with common shrews being the only native recorded in recent years. Next please, Eleanor. The mill pond, once part of the working corn mill, is fed by springs and flushes which provide an aquatic corridor for young European eels, which is the top picture, and that is what we call a glass eel, a very young eel that was brought out of a river here on the Isle of Man, and one of the fisheries officers who has permission to do this type of work is holding the glass eel in his hand for photograph. It was then safely returned to the river. So European eels reach the mill pond on the Calf via the springs and flushes, as I just mentioned, and they manage to leave the sea and use these spring and flushes as aquatic corridors. Here they will spend most of their adult lives in the mill pond before reaching sexual maturity and returning to the ocean for the long migration back to the Sargasso Sea, where they will breed and unfortunately die. Eels are described by the International Union for Conservation of Nature as being critically endangered. It is believed that as a species they have declined internationally by up to 95%, making them one of the CARF's priority conservation species. Next slide, please, Eleanor. Finally, I'd just like to mention that the CARF is managed for other aspects of its story, such as its cultural history, tourism, and archaeology. We aim to further our understanding of the many features of the CARF through new and closer links with further education colleges, with universities, and of course with other UNESCO Biosphere sites. So we've got some pictures here with, this is the CARF crucifixion stone, as Edmund referred to earlier. We've got some Warra breed Manx Lockton sheep there at the bottom, who help to keep down the vegetation through grazing. The other side, as part of the social history, we've got the stone grain silo, and at the top we have one of the Stevenson lighthouses. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to pass you on now to Dr. Peter Duncan.
Thanks so much, Erica. I hope my slide sharing kept up with you. I know there is a section in the middle there I sped through too quickly, but that was really interesting.
No, that was super. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eleanor, for your support.
Thanks, Erica. Peter, are you? Can you hear us? I know that you had trouble with your slides, but are you able to say a few words? Or there he is. Thank you.
I think hopefully I have managed to resolve my earlier problems. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me okay? The volume's
Yeah,
okay?
perfect.
Good. Okay. So thanks very much for the two introductory talks that we've had, which gives a bit of scope about the calf of man from a terrestrial perspective. I'm going to talk today a little bit about the fact that it's relatively recently been created as one of our main nature reserves. The Department of Environment, Food and Agriculture works closely with a lot of the organisations on the island, such particularly Manx Wildlife Trust, but also Manx Whale Dolphin Watch, Manx Basking Shark Watch, and Manx BirdLife, etc. So I have shamelessly used some of their images and slides, but as I said, it is something of a collaborative effort for this. So acknowledgement as due. I thought I would speak a little bit about Manx Marine Nature Reserves before I talk specifically about the calf of man. So this diagram on the map on the right of your screen there really shows the Manx Marine Nature Reserves in dark blue, and there are 10 of them now. And these were legally designated in July of 2018, so relatively recently, although their history as marine protected areas dates back actually almost 30 years. But designating them specifically as marine nature reserves under Manx law with a designation order and their own bylaws was a really important move, because it puts them gives them legal status, but it also protects them from a legal perspective as well, which is increasingly important. if you have a look at that map again, the yellow area is the extent of the Manx Territorial Sea, which goes out to 12 nautical miles. And you'll see that all of the MNRs at present are located within 3 nautical miles. So in that 3-mile area. I won't go into detail about why that is, but it's partly to do with the fact that there's relatively more biodiversity and habitats in that area, but there's also legal and constitutional reasons why it's actually easier for us to designate those protected areas close inshore. So, as I said, there are 10 marine nature reserves. They cover about 430 square kilometres in total, and the whole territorial sea is about 4,000 square kilometres. So we're basically looking at around about 10%, a little bit over, of our whole territorial sea area is now within marine nature reserves, and that's respects about 50% of the 0 to 3. So it's quite a significant, quite a significant proportion of it. And as you can imagine, that's taken quite a lot of negotiation over the years with other users. The marine nature reserves are the core areas of biosphere from a marine perspective. This is one of the original designation maps of the biosphere, which was done in 2016. And you'll notice that only a few of the marine protected areas are actually on there. So I suspect that, and this is what it looks like now. So I suspect that when we're up for review in the next year or two, we'd probably be proposing all of the marine nature reserves as core areas of biosphere. And I just put that fairly simple website on at the bottom. You can find a lot more about our marine nature reserves on the government website. Okay, so from having legal status under the Wildlife Act, marine nature reserves are specifically for conserving marine flora and fauna or geological or physiogeographical features of special interest. So they actually have to meet a particular status under law. And in that sense, each of the marine nature reserves has a range of designated features that we're trying to protect and look after. And in that sense, we can have a holistic view when we made to designate all of these, that we tried to protect a good range of different habitats and species. And because they're all the way around the coast, there was some attempt to try and link them ecologically. That's not always possible, and who knows what that means anyway. But certainly having that amount of coverage has enabled us to really cover most of the representative species and habitats that we're interested in. But it's all very well designating these things. It's the importance as a conservation tool really comes whether you can actually understand what's there, how that might be changing, have legal backing to protect them, introduce a management plan, have objectives for it in the long term, as we've heard from some of the talks earlier, and actually implement that management, make sure it's complied with. And I think really importantly in the biosphere context is to carry the community with you. Why are we protecting this? What does it offer for the community? They're not places that we discourage people from using, and they really have to be something that people value. And that ranges from the fishing industry to recreational people to basically everyone. So that there's an awful lot has gone into and will go into managing these marine nature reserves in future. Okay, so if we focus a little bit on the Calf and Wart Bank Marine Nature Reserve, I'll go through a very, very brief history of it, some of the features and some of the inhabitants that we can expect to see. And I think the thing to remember is that having a marine area around the terrestrial island itself, there's a fundamental interaction between what goes on land and sea and vice versa. And so having a protected area of water around such an important island is really critical to, as I said, that ecological approach to conservation. So there's the Calf and Wart Bank marine nature reserve in context of the rest of the island. In a little bit more detail, you can see that the boundaries are always quite curious as to how we come up with these things. But as you can imagine, there's a degree of compromise in that, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second as to how some of those boundaries are. You'll notice that projection off to the east, which is the Wart bank, which is a subtidal sandbar, very shallow at certain states of the tide, but equally important, particularly, I'll talk a little bit about it in its relation to providing food sources for a lot of the animals that live around this area. And not to say that I mentioned this idea of ecological connectivity. There are quite a lot of marine nature reserves surrounding this area, so it's not sitting in isolation. There are interactions between protected areas to the north and to the east as well. So this is the island. We've seen some images from it. This is actually from the north looking to the southwest. There's the Calf of Man in the background, and there's a couple of small islets in what's called the Sound, Calf Sound. And there's a fantastic, one of the real features I'll mention a bit more in a second of this area is the phenomenal water movement, the currents, the tidal races that move and deliver food, nutrients, oxygen, etc. into this area. And the tide runs through the Calf of Man at somewhere about 5 knots. So it makes fantastic drift diving. It brings, as I said, a lot of food and nutrients, etc., to the area. And it's also been important from a perspective of shipwrecks and safe navigation, which is in part why there are so many lighthouses on the Calf. But anyway, the Marine Nature Reserve itself covers about 20 square kilometres, about 2 and a bit % of the whole of the 0 to 3. It's an obvious marine protected area candidate, has been for some time partly because of the Calf and its nature and bird observatory status for years. And it shows you how important timing is. It was considered as a marine nature reserve many years ago, and for various reasons that I won't go into, it ran foul of public opinion at the time and was actually to a large extent derailed by the public not supporting the idea of it being a nature reserve. But more recently, things change, and the island has taken a slightly more strategic and things like fisheries management. And so isolating or protecting, if you like, 20 square kilometres of sea area where people have been fishing for many, many years is obviously something that doesn't come instantly. You have to actually negotiate with people. I put on this map, there's a couple of areas that show fishing ground, particularly scallop fishing ground, and these, these are genuine areas that the fishing industry gave up, and in return for that, the government has worked with them to develop co-management arrangements and give the industry a lot more say in the areas that are really, really important to them. And in return, we've had negotiated arrangements whereby marine nature reserves could be given up, but they provide fishing benefits as well as conservation benefits. So as I said, I think over time, the idea of marine conservation has developed, and I think it's now very well supported by the fishing industry, which is really critical. If I was to identify one particular feature of the Calf of Man and the Wart Bank area, it's that massive movement of water during the tidal cycle, and we have almost 9-meter tides around the island. All that water sloshing backwards and forward. It has to go somewhere, and it delivers an awful lot of benefits with it. It's predominantly a rocky seabed area, although there are marl beds and kelp forests and caves and such like in the sandbank that I mentioned, but it's really dominated by rock. It has a lot of organisms associated with it, a lot of sea anemones, a lot of organisms that rely on currents to deliver nutrients and food and what have you. It's one of the best places, the few places where you can find spiny lobster, which is quite a rare species around us. But I concentrate perhaps on these sand eels, and that's why the link with Wart Bank is really important. These are quite abundant fish. They're associated with sandbanks, but they form a fundamental part of the diet for things like puffins and shearwaters and guillemots, etc. And so once you have that establishment with feeding and bird populations, you can see that there's an important trophic link, a link in the food chain, which allows, as I said, birds, various large marine mammals, whether it's basking sharks, which are again feeding in the currents around this area. It's a good area for common for bottlenose dolphins, a pod of bottlenose dolphin just north of the Wart Bank here. Common dolphins are not that common around the island, but if you were ever to see them, it would be around about that Wart Bank area and just to the east of there. And through this picture was taken in the Sound. This is actually one of our biggest dolphin species, the Risso's dolphin, and a really spectacular photo taken by Eleanor Stone when she worked for Manx Wildlife Trust. This species, if I was to pick a spot where you would find them, it's just again around the calf and to the east of the calf. So some quite spectacular sort of megafauna brought into the area. There's a good population of particularly grey seals in this area, and I think Lara will talk about that next. But if you're interested in seeing how the diving, how you can get some fantastic interactions with marine life, just do a simple diving the puddle search on YouTube, and I guarantee you'll have an interesting insight into the calf and its seal population. So I'm just going to sort of end by showing you some really spectacular photographs, again taken by Lara and various other divers around the island. And if you keep an eye out, these are anemones, plumose anemones, with a nice brown crab sitting in the middle of them all. But those organisms that filter feed, that catch their food attached to the rocky substrate, I think it's really evidenced by the images that I'm just about to show you. So again, beautiful little jewel anemones. The rocks around this area are completely covered in various types of anemone. And these images are really sort of maybe more reminiscent of tropical systems rather than what you might expect in the Irish Sea. So all of the walls covered in anemones of various kinds, soft corals, hard corals, etc., and the fish that live off them. Kelp forests associated with those rocky reefs. There's an abundance of beautiful little sea slugs in this area, including one which, as far as we know, is unique to the Isle of Man so far. This is the crested aeolus sea slug. A lot of hydroids, which look like plants but are actually animals, and they're munched on by sea slugs, such as this milky sea slug eating ocean pipe hydroids. So because of all the rocky crevices, etc., there's a lot of crab and lobster, so there's actually quite a lot of fishing for that. It's a good spot for fishing. In the background, you can see those plumose anemones again, all over the rocks, crabs, and more hydroids, which are excellent substrates for settlement of scallops on. This is a colonial sea squirt, very pretty little animal. Background again with anemones and a filter feeding crinoid or sea lily, which is actually an echinoderm. Lots of nice crevices for ling, good eating fish if you're that way inclined. and some cuckoo wrasse, female cuckoo wrasse with urchins in the background. As I said, really, quite spectacular stuff. A sun star with some light bulb sea squirts in the background. As I said, things you might, color-wise, you might associate more with tropical areas rather than our cold waters here, but full of life. And as I said, that's why we're protecting areas such as the calf. So you can find out a little bit more on our regular Biosphere newsletter, which Joe Overty looks after. And in collaboration with Manx Wildlife Trust, we actually have a Facebook page which covers the Manx marine nature reserves in general. So that's a little bit of a view on the Calf of Man and the Wart Bank from a marine perspective. Thank you all.
Thanks, Peter. Laura, we were due to go over to you next. Are you still with us? Yeah,
I am indeed, yes.
Thank you so much. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. We need to finish sharing screens, if that's okay, Peter. So there we go, that should work. Excellent. Hopefully everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, it's just loading.
Yeah.
There you
Brilliant.
go.
Okay, thanks, Peter. As I said, my name's Laura Howe. I'm the Marine Officer with the Manx Wildlife Trust. And this afternoon, I'm going to give you a bit of a run through on some of the long-term monitoring that's been undertaken on the calf. We've heard in the previous talks about the calf being a bird observatory, but I want to talk about some of the other monitoring that's undertaken, not necessarily linked with the observatory. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about the grey seals and our Manx shearwaters. As already sort of said, calf is an amazing wildlife haven, which is why it's one of our core areas under our biosphere status, both above and below the water. So it was really nice to see some of those lovely images from Peter about the marine side of things. As the marine officer, I always feel sometimes that side of things gets sort of overseen, some underappreciated. So really, really nice to be able to talk about that. So I'm going to talk a bit about seals first. We have two species around the Isle of Man and the calf, and that's the Atlantic grey seal, which you can see on the left here, and then the common or harbour seal, which is on the right. Although they're common seals, they're actually not very common around the Isle of Man at all. In fact, they probably make up less than 5% of our Manx population. Greys are most definitely the most abundant species that we tend to see. And they'll haul out around the calf all year round. The greys coming particularly in the autumn to breed and to pup. And that's where our work is focused on. So the Wildlife Trust, with support of Manx Natural Heritage, have been undertaking seal surveys for, like I said, our grey seals since 2009. And basically it originally started with a feasibility study in 2008, seeing whether it was an option or not. And thankfully it was. So we've been surveying since 2009. And basically this involves a very keen bunch of volunteers going over to the calf to monitor the pups breeding over there. So originally started with a 4-week window with volunteers going over for 4 weeks. Usually starts sort of in September time, and the breeding season ends in mid to late November. But we realised as the surveys were carrying on that actually the breeding period was actually much bigger than the 4 weeks that we initially thought. So now the surveys are undertaken under 8 weeks, and we're still not quite catching the start and the end of the season. We're finding that season is expanding, and there's possibly links to climate change associated with that. And there's some work being done by Swansea University looking at the wider populations of seals and their breeding periods. So we have originally a band of volunteers, quite a few, that would go over and do a week at a time, but we found that the handover of sort of highlighting which seal pups were where was becoming more difficult, and also as the catalogue becomes bigger. So we actually have 2 volunteers who now do the full season, who go over for that whole time period to monitor the seals, and that's provided better continuity and better surveying. So what do we survey for? So one of the first things we do is we want to monitor the pup numbers, how many pups are being born each year, and we want to monitor them through their developmental stages. So you can see from the picture here, we have 5 developmental stages that they go through. It'll take them up to 25 days to be completely weaned by mum, and once they're weaned, they're left to fend for themselves. If conditions are really good, they'll be weaned quicker, maybe 18 days. If conditions aren't so good, maybe there's not so much food availability or there's more stormy conditions, they tend to stay with mum for a lot longer. So the seal that you can see on the left here sat on the rock is probably a stage 3, really sort of fat, rotund individual, still with the white fur, the white pelage, and they kind of lose their neck now. They kind of just come and look like this sort of torpedo fat barrage balloon shape. So very happily progressing through those stages there. So what have we found out through monitoring our pups? So here we have a map of the calf here. And you can see that we're looking at the numbers of pups that have been born and also the locations. So obviously, the bigger the spots, the more seals pups that have been born. So key areas, so that northeast corner and then the south coast. And this is predominantly because there are really good beaches here that are really nice for hauling up, gentle sloping, lots of space. And height to get away from, you know, the high water mark or any stormy conditions. So they can haul up above that high water mark, so they're not swept back out to sea. You'll see that there's hardly any pups recorded for the east and the west coast. That's because it's very cliffy, this area, and there's nowhere really for them to haul up. You don't even really get adults hauling up in these areas. There's just nowhere really for them to haul up. So they pick the best places where there's good, nice cobbly beaches for them to haul up. We don't really have sandy beaches around the calf, so it's mostly sort of cobbly beaches and shingle that they'll haul up on. So there's a graph here showing the numbers of pups that have been born since the surveys began. So you can see in 2009 we only had sort of 20 plus seals being born, and now we're into the 60s and have been consistently there for the last few years. I think this is partly because there's been a bit of an increase in the numbers, but also partly, as I said at the beginning when we talked about surveys, that we were only surveying for a shorter period of time, so we were missing sort of the start of the breeding and the end of the pupping season. So we were missing a few, and I suspect we still are now. This year we did 8 weeks, and we already had 2 that were born already. And also we know from trips back to the calf to check on things as late as December, we're finding pups then. So although that's unusual to find pups that late in the season, it does happen. So we're not catching all of them. But you can see we had a spike in 2016 where we had over 80 pups born, which was really good to see. But we seem to have sort of plateaued now and found this equilibrium. Again, like I said, I think space is a limiting factor for where the pups can haul up. So I think maybe we've reached our carrying capacity. So pup mortality, it's a bit of a sad bit to talk about really, but it does happen. We have quite a good survivability rate on the calf. Our average is around about 6%. Some years it's as bad as 15% of the population is lost. This last year was quite a bad year, I think, with around about 11% loss. We occasionally get stillbirths. That's something we've observed more recently. But predominantly a lot of the mortality linked with storm conditions. Surprisingly, grey seals as pups are really not very good at swimming at all, unlike the common seals, which are practically born in water and very able swimmers from very early days. Our grey seals aren't quite good, so they struggle in stormy conditions. So that's generally why we lose a few of our grey seal pups each year. One of the things we've noticed more recently is allo suckling. So this is where a grey seal mum will suckle 2 pups. So normally seals will only give birth, grey seals will only give birth to 1 pup. So this is unusual, really. So you can see in the picture here, this was taken from the surveys last year, that there's a female here suckling her pup. And then you can see the other little pup waiting in the wings. And what actually happened is when their pup had finished feeding, this other pup came in. Generally, this doesn't happen. So we've seen this for the last few years, which is quite an interesting behaviour to observe. Talk a little bit about site fidelity as well. We're finding that the same individuals are coming back to the calf time and time again. They're also coming back to the same beaches. The females are fairly consistently coming back to the same beaches that they had pups in previous years. And again, it's that northeast sort of south areas that they're predominantly focusing on and returning to the same places. We're also finding some of our males are doing the same thing. They'll have their harem of ladies that they will protect and defend until they're ready to breed after they finish pupping, and it'll usually be the same few beaches that you'll find that the males will congregate around, and they have their own areas. The other part of the work that we do is the photo identification work. So our grey seals have unique spot patterns as we have unique fingerprints. So you can see in the image here, this is Heart Bean, and you can see she's got a lovely little heart-shaped sort of shaped on her right side of her neck. So we build up this catalogue of our individuals, and from that we know we've got around 400 females in the catalogue and around about 40 males. So there's quite a difference in numbers. And then we also have a catalogue which is our left, right, nearly catalogue, which is images where we've only got a left shot of the individual or a right side shot. We don't have the complete picture, and we have to have both for the catalogue to be worked. And this is helping us to identify these individuals, and we're seeing that there are new individuals coming in every year, and obviously some of our old ones. So this is Mr. Velvet here. He's one of our big males who has been seen, I think, nearly every year since the surveys began, one of our alpha males, and he has some of the primo beach space that he guards his ladies with. But this photo identification data has been really important in helping us to get to know our individual species and their habitats. I talked before about the site fidelity. Well, we wouldn't know that without knowing, you know, the identity of those individuals, to be able to see them coming back year and year again. But also what we're hoping is that once our juvenile seals have grown up and been weaned, we're hoping that we'll see them coming back to breed on the calf as they were born on the calf. We haven't seen that yet, but we're hopeful through the photo ID catalogue to build up this picture of the individuals. So what the other really interesting thing that the photo ID work has helped us to work out is how mobile these species are. I refer to our calf seals, but actually they may not be at all ours. We know from some work that was done at St Andrews through the Seal Mammal Research Unit, SMRU, in about 2008, they satellite tagged some seals in a Strangford loch that you can see here. And this very scrawly mess that looks like a 2-year-old has scribbled all over my screen is actually seal movements. So you can see some of them have moved off to the north of the island, but there's an individual that's actually been going backwards and forwards to the calf for several months over the period that the tags have been in place. So basically it doesn't hurt the animals, they just glue this satellite tag to the back of the heads, and when the fur sheds, they molt every year, the tag comes off, so it doesn't cause them any harm at all. So this was the first time we'd really sort of started to see this mobility and movement in our species. And then later again, through SMRU, they did some tagging work at Hilbury, and we found again one of their seals came to the calf of man. You can see again this red squiggly line here, how they've been hanging out in the calf. And if you think back to Peter's talk about the marine nature reserves and the protection of the calf and Wart bank, you can see that area is important for feeding for our seal, particularly this individual. So it's really helping us to identify areas that need to be protected for our mobile species, like our seals. And in the picture here, you can see this is actually a photo that one of the volunteers took a few years ago of this specific individual with the satellite tag on the back of the head there. So we've seen them moving backwards and forwards, and she actually had a pup that year. But the most recent interesting find was with Tulip Bell here. So to us, she is the 079, but to the Cornwall Seal Research Group, she's Tulip Bell. And Sue Sayer down in Cornwall very kindly has been comparing our photo ID catalogue with theirs, and it's all done by eye. So it's very time consuming comparing the images. As I said, we've got over 400 females alone. Their catalogue is much bigger than ours. But we found this connection. So Tulip Bell has been travelling between Cornwall and the Isle of Man for several years now, and has been pupping regularly on the calf, which is really nice. And more recently, we've had another Cornwall sighting of a seal. A local kayaker found a seal. He was out kayaking and mounts a little video camera off the back of his kayak, and they found a tagged seal with one of the flipper tags on, and it's just a number, a bit like a cattle tag for livestock, and they've managed to track it back to Cornwall. So it was a seal that was collected, rehabilitated in Cornwall, and then tagged and released in Cornwall, and it's come to the Isle of Man. So again, there's this really dynamic, mobile population of seals in the Irish Sea and also in the Celtic Sea that without this photo ID work we wouldn't really know about. So it's really interesting to see these movements of the individuals, and hopefully this will continue to build on this long-term data set. Of course, I want to talk a little bit about the Manx Shearwater programme as well, and this is again talking about our links with other groups and people through the work that goes on the calf. Obviously, it was set up as a project with FERA and RSPB, the Wildlife Trust, Manx Natural Heritage, obviously heavily involved, and lots of volunteers to help with this work as well. As suggested, the Manx Shearwater is a Manx bird, and it was first recorded here in the 1600s. It was known as the Manx puffin. So there was a lot of confusion in the records when they talk about puffins, whether they're referring to Manx shearwaters or actually to puffins. And the Latin name is puffinus, so it adds to the confusion. Already mentioned, obviously the carcasses are cured and have been chipped off in huge numbers historically as payment for rental for the calf, for food in general terms. And it didn't seem to have an impact on the population. There were so many of them on the calf. Numbers were in the thousands upon thousands, that taking off several thousand individuals for food didn't seem to have a huge impact. What really happened was that there was a shipwreck. Edmund mentioned that the calf was quite a difficult area to navigate in days gone by, and sadly a shipwreck in the late 18th century hit the calf, and that released the brown rat. And I have to say, it's bad luck in the Isle of Man to say rat, so I apologise to all our Manx listeners. We call them longtails or ringies, and if you say it, the word, you have to either touch wood or whistle. So I apologise to the Manx listeners because I'm going to use that word occasionally. And sadly, the release of rats to the calf has had a huge impact on our ground nesting birds, and particularly the shearwaters, to the point that they weren't breeding on the calf for a very long period. It also had impacts on our puffins and many of our other birds, but focusing on the calf, again with the shearwaters, it wasn't until about 2000 that one of the wardens first realised they were breeding again. So this was when we started to monitor their breeding again, and also to start doing some ad hoc baiting around the colony to try and protect the shearwaters. So here's a lovely little shearwater chick sat out enjoying the stargazing. I won't go into the ringing and what we do, but basically it was decided in 2012 that something needed to be done to protect these Manx shearwaters. So this is where the Manx Shearwater programme began. So in the winter of 2012 and 2013, a formal eradication programme began to eradicate our rats. So this involved placing a 50-metre grid across the whole of the calf, and at every intersection placing rodenticide poison in tubes across the whole of the calf, with the aim to basically poison all of the rats on the calf. And then what happens is, once all of that bait is stopped being taken, quite often the the rats will take it away to stockpile, thinking it's food. Once that's stopped and we think that all of the rats have died off, we go into a monitoring phase, which is what we're now in, and we place wax blocks which are impregnated with chocolate or peanut butter or coconut, and basically we want to monitor to see what bites the wax block, so we can pick up the difference between a rabbit to a rat and a mouse and things like that. So that's enabled us to carry on monitoring, and we don't use the 50-metre grid now. We've expanded it. It's less intense now because we're in the monitoring phase. And basically we have to be 2 years clear of any signs of longtails before we can say that it's been a success. We always get to about 18 months and then we spot one. And very sadly, this is exactly what happened this year. The 1st of January, some of the Manx Natural Heritage staff and MWT staff went out to the car to just check everything was okay and working fine. And we checked one of the camera traps because we use these also to keep an eye out for the rats and their movements. There are 2 key areas where they seem to reappear, and we checked one of the camera traps, and lo and behold, we had a rat actually looked like it was dancing across one of the bait tubes, much to everyone's disappointment. However, although we may not have completely eradicated the rats from the calf, I'm pleased to say that we have reduced the numbers so significantly that it is having a positive impact on our breeding for our shearwaters. So you can see one of the tubes there in the background of the graph, and we just put the bait inside of that and then you close the lid round. But from the graph here, you can see that in 2000, when we had our first report, we're now in 2019 up to over 600 individuals in pairs breeding, which is absolutely phenomenal. And you can see that real increase has happened since 2012, 2013, when we really started that eradication program. Sadly, we can't include the 2020 data because there was nobody on the calf at the time thanks to COVID. The wardens had to be removed, so hopefully they'll go back this year. And we'll be able to monitor them, and hopefully this year we'll have even more shearwaters breeding on the calf. So thank you very much for listening. It just shows you the importance of this long-term monitoring on the calf and how it's helping us to inform us about these important species. And that hopefully it will continue on into the future, and the importance of the collaborative working that's been involved as well. You know, a lot of these programs take a lot of support and help and collaboration, and I think that links back into the biosphere. So it's a really wonderful to see, and hopefully there'll be more success and positive stories coming out. So thank you for listening, and now I'm going to pass you over to Lee, the CEO of the Manx Wildlife Trust, to close the presentations for today.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was brilliant. I just want to say as well, I mean, if anyone gets the opportunity, I did the seal survey and volunteering, and it's an amazing experience. And if you can get a chance to do it, I would absolutely recommend it. It's just a great thing to do. So yeah, we are running a little bit late, so I'll quickly pass over to Lee as we want to get some questions in at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Right, I'll share my screen. And I'll start my slides. So conscious I'm bringing up the end of some fantastic talks. I'm not going to repeat everything. Hopefully the aim of my talk is to give you a little bit of a flavour about our ambitions for the future. I'm going to start with this picture. So this is actually a picture taken last year when Manx Wildlife Trust signed a memorandum of understanding with Manx Natural Heritage. And the reason I think that's important is that, you know, the calf is an MNH property, and the Wildlife Trust, we've been working with them for a number of years. So our wardens team, and through Lara, the team that actually managed the bird observatory. So we signed an MOU last year. How does that change things for the calf, you ask? Well, I think one of the real positives that's come out of that now is an agreement that between us, we're going to really look at developing a research strategy for the calf. And I wanted to just put this picture up. So Erica's already included an image in her presentation about, you know, the British Isles and showing where the calf and the Isle of Man is. But I really want us to just take a second just to reinforce that and look at the British Isles and look where the Isle of Man is and look where the calf is. And we're right slap bang in the middle of the British Isles, and we're slap bang in the middle of the Irish Sea. And so in terms of our data collection, what we're collecting there is really fundamentally important to monitor things such as industrialisation of the Irish Sea,
or the climate change movement, and how that impacts on our biodiversity. You know, quick to react things, maybe you might say the basking sharks, right down to the flora, the things that are slower to react, but we're an important location. And so we've been having conversations and challenging ourselves really over the last few weeks and months about what should we do going forward, what are the important things that we keep, and what things might we actually change or do differently. And it's been personally interesting for me. You know, my background's really plants and education, not avian, for example. So just to be involved in the conversations with the Bird Observatories Council and also the BTO with colleagues from MNH about actually challenging ourselves about what should we be doing going forward. The first thing that we really want to assure you all is that, you know, and Eric has already used this picture of Rob. Sorry, Rob, if you're watching this, but it's a very photogenic picture of you doing the core work of the Bird Observatory. And that core work of our Bird Observatory is absolutely paramount for us. So we need to do that, and we need to keep doing that really well. We've got nearly a 60-year data set now. And those long-term data sets, again, coming back to our location, are things that we've got to sustain. But beyond that, and again, I saw one of the questions in the chat about, you know, breeding birds that have been lost from the calf. Undoubtedly, you know, things are being lost, and there are other important bird species that we need to focus on. And Lara's touched on the shearwaters, and again, the puffins. I think I've got a slide coming up about the ambition for the puffins. But be it, you know, be it choughs, be it wheatears, hen harriers, shags, or actually, if you look at shags there, think about seabirds across the whole of the Irish Sea. How do we, what are the movements of the seabirds around the Irish Sea that we could actually be focusing on key species to help answer some of the questions about what's happening in our environment? So we're drilling into those species about the ones we need to focus on. This is a picture of Aaron, our senior bird warden, and Rob again, and this was when we visited the calf one of the trips last year, and Aaron's there pulling out a lot of the coloured tags, and there, you know, Rob's ringing one of the herring gull chicks, but the coloured tags offer another dynamic. Some of you will know this listening in, but you know, you can see a coloured tag with a pair of binoculars. You don't have to net it and pick a bird up to see it. So the data that we can get potentially from herring gulls and other birds that we're colour tag ringing, that's one of the questions we're asking ourselves now, is that are there more birds? Do we need to actually increase the work that we're doing with coloured tags, coloured ringing? I have to mention the Manxes, the Manx shearwaters. Lara's told you about the work that we're doing and the massive success that we're having jointly with getting rid of the long tails, or at least reducing the long tails significantly to increase the breeding pairs number. I'm going to give you one example again around collaboration. So we were delighted last year ourselves in MNH, where the Manx Wildlife Park have now, through their conservation fund, are funding us to actually help with that conservation work. So as well as funding, you know, animals around the world in conservation projects, then they're now focusing on Isle of Man species. And so money that we've got from them this year is going to actually fund thermal imaging cameras that we can start to use to get more data about the expanding breeding Manx shearwaters. Puffins, again, thanks to Moz and other organisations, I saw a question in the chat, when was the last breeding puffin on the calf? I couldn't answer that. Maybe one of my colleagues at the end could, but certainly we are hoping. We know that there's puffins nesting close to the calf, and we're really, you know, all fingers crossed that through the decoy birds and the speakers that we'll actually get puffins again nesting on the calf, and that will be a real landmark for us if we do that. Technology. What do we do beyond that? So through Aaron and others, we've been saying, right, you know, we do the netting, we do the daily logs, we stand there with binoculars and we record those bird sightings. And as I said previously, that long-term data set is really important for us. But how could we do it maybe different with technology? So one of my colleagues, Graham, is looking at how we can actually engage people more with the work on the calf through live link-ups and digital online cameras, so that you can actually go on and see birds, or you can see seals. But actually there's technology now that we're becoming aware of, and our conversations with BCO and BTO have led us to really challenge now about, you know, do we engage with the motor solutions? Should we be actually putting tags on birds and putting an aerial up and actually collecting data from other birds that have been tagged as well? And then there's the nocturnal audio recording, same as we do commonly with our bat surveys for ecological surveying. you know, that knock-mig technology is something that, again, we're considering using on the calf to actually record more data there. Away from birds, you've had some examples of non-avian, be it Lepidoptera and moths and butterflies. Lara's talked about the seals, Eric has mentioned the lizards, and Peter's done a great presentation about the marine environment. And I know one of the things that Lara didn't have time to mention today was the small shark tagging, and that's a really important data set, you know, be it tope, spur dog, around the calf, that we're keen to keep doing that. Again, something else that Erica touched on was the bracken control. So I'm very conscious, again, from colleagues of the impact that the bracken and the heather could have on nesting birds on the calf. And there's been work done in the past on that. We've actually realised last week that we've got some stuff squirreled away around herbicide wiping equipment that we can trial. But people have done this sort of work in other places, and part of our thinking now in terms of our research strategies to really sort of maybe test this and come up with strategies that we can test on the calf in a small measurable way that allows us over maybe a few years, but hopefully quite quickly, to really start to build up a proper strategy for what we do for this. And importantly, our research can then measure the impacts of what we do for the bracken directly on key indicator bird species. So again, that could be an important thread of what we do. Ecotourism. We've got some courses planned this year. I know Aaron and Sean at MNH have been working hard to develop things. So book quickly will be my top tip, be it for introduction to bird watching, going away and actually having an immersive holiday experience where you're supporting the Manx shearwater work, learning how to dry stone wall, etc. And these are things that we're piloting this year with the ambition that if it's successful, we'll hopefully be able to bring some funding in to help us to do more work, but also enable more people, a wider audience, to engage with the conservation work really positively in what we're doing on the calf. So that's been piloted this year. A little bit of an apology for putting a money slide in. Some of my colleagues at Manx Wildlife Trust would know that money's not a dirty word. We have some really great ambitions for what we'd like to do on the calf. We want to keep doing what we're doing now really well, but we'd like to add to that. And Lara, just the example that Lara gave around the seal tagging, some of the technology that we're looking at for the birds is actually quite affordable. You know, you don't need to find major donors to do that. We need donors, but we don't need major ones. But if you want to put a tag on a seal, it's thousands of pounds. But imagine if that data set is something that we absolutely decide as a core group is really important for us, and we almost have to do it. And if then we have to do it, then we have to find ways to fund it. So we're certainly hopeful that once we come out with our strategy and it's really clear what we're doing, people will want to help us and actually enable us to really do something positive for the calf going forward. Communications, please engage with us. I'm going to shamelessly now promote the work that the calf team do in terms of promoting what they do. They have a fantastic Twitter channel, so find the calf obs on Twitter. We did a webinar last year, or Aaron and Rob and Dan ran a webinar last year as part of Manx Nature Week, and there'll be another one this year. We're doing the one today, which is fantastic, and we've got some great films and information on the observatory on the Manx Wildlife Trust website. So please do connect to us, connect with the calf team, and follow what they're doing, because it really does make a difference. So my last slide really was just a chance to put a picture in from when I last went, or actually no, it wasn't when I last went, this was taken from last summer. But I think that's representative there. We've got the Wardens team in the centre, myself and Lara from Manx Wildlife Trust, and really crucially the MNH team of Sean and Erica there, you know, working together as a partnership for the calf of man. So it's been lovely to wrap up. I hope that's given you a little flavour of what we're aiming to do in the future, and we'd certainly like to work with more people. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. That was brilliant. So that takes us to the last of our speakers. Thank you so much to everyone who's been involved, and hopefully it's been really informative anyway, and I've learned a lot more things today, and I just hope that everybody enjoyed it. Now, I know that we're approaching 1:30 now, but we do have some questions. We did say that we would do a Q&A toward the end, so excuse my fingers, I'm just going to have a little look, find the question. And so Simon Curtis has asked, I know there is a warden or are wardens who stay on the Calf. How many are there? How long is each stay? And how does one get involved, either as a warden or in collecting data as part of the team? Now I can see that Edmund has answered that in the chat, but I don't know if you could maybe provide a little bit more information about the wardens, Edmund, and their length of stay and things like that.
Well, we've got two wardens who between them carry out the research as well as the day-to-day maintenance and operation. But of course, they're actually employees of the Wildlife Trust, and they're backed up by volunteers supplied through the Trust, as well as my own team who do the logistics. So there's quite, like all these things, there's quite a long supply chain to make sure that the wardens can work. And clearly they're there for a traditional season, and it's been based around the migration season, and partly also because getting to the island is not easy. We've heard about the currents. It's a pretty dangerous piece of water, and there are many times of the year when we can't get people safely to and from the island. So the winter tends not to be ideal for that. Okay.
That's great. Thanks, Edmund, for that. I'm actually just looking at some of the questions that have come in, and there's a lot of them that have been answered, like you've responded to them. So what I'm going to do is try and take those answers and those questions and include them in a follow-up email. So if any of our attendees haven't been able to find the Q&A or read those as they come through, we'll follow up with them afterwards. And there's another question that's come in that's kind of following up on what you've just spoken about, but maybe more in terms of the marine area. What do people do with the marine protected areas if they see like an activity taking place that they don't think should be happening in that area? What do they do? Who do they contact? How do they report that activity? And then I suppose on the other side of that, how as a local person can you get involved in that? Maybe Edmund, you can answer that, or maybe Peter as well would like to jump in.
It might be better for Peter to respond to that if he's still there. Yes.
Yep. Hi, if you can hear me. Yeah, I think it's a really important point and touches on what I said earlier about how we do need to engage people as well. These are not my marine nature reserves or governments, that they belong to the Manx public, and so protecting them is really it's critical that people are aware and watch, and we really rely on people phoning in. In fact, we just had one over the weekend that we've been dealing with this morning. So if you go onto the website, and I don't expect people to become legal experts overnight, but if you can see the bylaws, the basic rules, which the things that you're not supposed to do in marine nature reserves. But if you have concerns of any matter, really phone DEFA, phone the Fisheries Division. I work in the Fisheries Division. But you call DEFA and ask, and someone will get back to you, and we'll follow it up, no question. I think it's a really important point to make. And just someone asked, I was just about to reply, the spiny lobster, someone asked about them. The answer to the question is yes, they are protected in the 3 major reserves in the south, which is where at the moment we know that they inhabit. But if anyone knows that they live somewhere else, then maybe we could look at protecting them in the other marine nature reserves as well. And we really do depend on public telling us where things are, new species, etc., etc. That means we can keep up with appropriate protection, etc. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Peter. I wanted to say, first of all, thank you so much for fantastic presentations. Certainly from ourselves, we look to the Isle of Man and we're learning an awful lot of the Isle of Man. And that you're particularly strong with regards to your looking after businesses, working with businesses, the sustainable development side of things. So there's a couple of queries here that kind of link back to that to some degree. The first one is from Michael Josem. The Calf of Man Wart Bank area might have the potential for a tidal stream electrical power generation because of the movement of tides within the area. Would making it an MNR prevent the construction of such tidal stream power generators in the area? Okay, so that's part one. And then Tim Cross asks, looking at the MNR area, does this prevent the area being used for the production of green energy using the tidal streams in the south? So they're kind of linked there. So who would maybe like to answer that question?
I can say a little bit about
Thanks,
it.
Evan.
Yeah.
Quickly. Marine nature reserves, if you look at the legislation, they don't technically anything is possible if you have a permit to do it. I know that sounds a little bit vague, but what we don't want to do with legislation is make it too clunky to make it unworkable. And so if there was a project that could come along and satisfy the requirements, and there would be all sorts of processes that went through it, it is conceivable that we could have a green energy project in one of them. The marine nature reserves, we have an active scallop fishery in Ramsey, have done for many years, and it works very well. It's just about how it's managed. So there are processes to put in place to assess those things and manage them properly, but it doesn't necessarily mean that activities are prohibited as a matter of course, which I think is probably in keeping with the biosphere.
That's great. That's perfectly answered. Thank you, Peter. Appreciate that.
I think Edmund, did you want to comment on that question as well? I see you had your hand up.
Yes, really to agree with Peter, there are three areas of very high tidal strength that are being considered around the island. And I think the technology that was being demonstrated at Strandford Lock, which is basically almost like a wind turbine underwater, a very large bladed turbine technology, seems to be the sort of thing that would work, but it's still quite expensive by comparison with wind turbine. Offshore wind is clearly something the island wants to look at first before going down the rather complicated undersea renewables. Bear in mind, all of these things need connections into the land. And one of the challenges we've got is if you set up a renewables offshore, you've still got to get it onshore. And the difficulty is finding an area on the Isle of Man that isn't sensitive in order to bring cabling and associated infrastructure onshore. And many of our coastal areas are themselves very sensitive. And, you know, at the moment, it's the equivalent to a power station on the beach, which is equally challenging at the moment.
Thank you very much, Edmund. I'm just looking at the time and we have gone over by about 10 minutes. So sadly, we're not going to get through all of the questions, but Eleanor, like she kindly said, that she will be able to kind of pull together like a Q&A on the follow-up email. And this has been recorded, this webinar, so this will be shared by us for anyone who missed it, or if you want to share it around. And then also I'd like to thank the National Parks and Wildlife Service for sponsoring the Zoom account. That means that we can have so many people watch these webinars, which is brilliant. And yeah, just a big thank you really to everyone who's watched today, from everybody who's done a talk today. It's all been really, really interesting. And please do keep your eyes peeled. We will be back. We'll be back next month. And I believe we'll be back in Dublin. Will we be?
That's right.
Will you?
Yeah, we're going to have the Irish Whale and Dolphin group regale lots of interesting stories about their work. So that promises to be a very, very interesting one. Thank you.
Yeah, so do keep your eyes peeled and we will return. And thank you again. It's been really, really good and really informative.